Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we will tackle about the Queen's Gambit decline in a Tartakower variation. So before we look at to the set opening, let us try first to solve this puzzle. So it is black to play and make the white king in just 3 moves. So to solve the puzzle, first we will track down the position of the white king. So it is on the king to e2. And second is we will try to limit the possible movement of the white king. So the white king can probably go for king f3, king e3, and going back to d1 square. So the white king cannot go on e1 and to d2 because there is a queen on the b4 square. And again, for example, if we try to move our queen here to d2, although we stop these squares for the white king, but he can actually escape here on the f3. So therefore, we should stop first the white king to go on f3. And it comes with a check, for example, after bishop to g4 check. So the king has only one square to go, and it is king to d3. But later on, we can play to queen to d2 and checkmate the white king on the d3 square. So for example, after bishop to g4, if the white here, for example, block the check, but it is still the same after queen to d2 checkmate. So what if, for example, after bishop to g4 check, the white here captured that bishop, but still it is the same after queen to d2 check. So the only square the white king goes is this square. And after the white king moves to f3 square, but it is already now a checkmate because there is no possible defense against the check on the f2 square. So going back on the initial position, as like I said, we will try to tackle about the Tartakower variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. So the Queen's Gambit decline start with the moves of d4, d5, c4, and e3. So the black here tries to decline this gambit, but rather to try to open some lines for his pieces, for example, the bishop and the queen, and later on, he can immediately go for a rapid development, for example, and put his king into safety. So after knight to c3, knight f6, although there is bishop g5 pinning down this knight to eliminate some possible defense to this d5 pawn, but there is simple bishop to e2 and pinning the knight. And after e3, trying to open up some lines for the white light square bishop, but again, the black can simply just develop his pieces. And after knight f3, and here comes now the Tartakower variation of the Queen's Gambit that actually a significant move with b6. So with the idea of the b6 move, it actually open up some diagonal for the light square bishop of black. As from the fact, this bishop can no longer go for an activity, for example, on this diagonal because it was actually blocked by its own pieces. So the black here tries to open up some lines for the bishop. For example, if the bishop will be developed on this diagonal, for example, if the bishop will be developed on this diagonal, then the bishop on c8 will be extremely strong in the future. So after b6, the white here captured now the d5, and again, the black here should actually place knight takes to d5 rather than e takes to d5, because at some point, if this pawn will be on d5, then this bishop on b7 will block on the diagonal on this aa2 h1 square on this diagonal. For example, if this pawn will be on the d5, so after, for example, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and again trying to regain the piece. But for example, after knight takes to g5, and again, although on this position, the black cannot capture this knight because there is knight takes c7 with a fork. So again, the black is obliged now to capture that knight on d5 that actually blocks now this diagonal for the possible bishop b7 and a control to this long light square diagonal from aa2 h1. So for example, after queen to h5, threatening to mate in 1, but there is simple g6, and after queen h6, trying to stop the black here to go with his natural move by putting his queen into safety through castling, but there is queen f6, again trying to stop any possible infiltration of the queen to g7, but there is knight takes h7, and again with an attack to the queen on f8, and again gaining some material on the h7 square. But For example, after queen to d6, queen to g7, trying to win now the rook on h8, but there is queen to b4. And after king to d1, escaping from the check to the queen on b4, rook takes h7, queen takes h7, and knight f6. And again, we shall go back into the initial position that we actually solved the puzzle, for example, after queen to h4. And again, after queen to h4, and for example, knight to e4, again, on this position, the white here is actually totally lost on this position. Wherever the white here goes, for example, king to e2, and there is a checkmate in 3, for example. And again, it is still the same, even though he can go to another square, for example, because there is a threat to checkmate in 1. So for example, if he goes to another square, for example, king to c2, but there is bishop to f5, rook to d1, trying to make some defense, but after queen a4 check, king c1, queen c6 check, and after some couple of moves, king b1, knight c3 check with double checks, so there is no capture to the checking pieces and a cover to the check, but only escape, for example. But still there is knight to b1, and after bishop to c4, it is already now checkmate after queen takes c4 checkmate, because there is no possible defense to the check on c4. So for example, after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop g7, e3, and knight bd7, knight f3, b6, the Tartakower variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. C takes to d5 is actually good for the white here to challenge now the idea of b6 of the black. And for example, after knight takes to d5 and knight takes to d5, bishop takes to g5 is actually not a good move for the black here, but instead to capture this knight on the d5 square. Because for example, after the content move of bishop takes to g5, there is simple knight takes to 7 with a check and a fork to the rook and king. And let's say for example, after queen takes c7, but there is knight takes to g5. And again, after some couple of moves, after bishop b7, going to his Tartakower bishop, but there is rook to c1, and again, on this position, the white here is still a pawn up. So after knight takes to g5, although it forced now for the black here to go for e takes to d5, and again, blunting this diagonal so that it neutralizes this bishop, because if the bishop will be on this square on the b7, then the bishop will be totally in dominating position. But after here in this position with the pawn, again, this bishop can actually be not so powerful on this position. For example, after queen to h5 and g6, trying to attack the queen, queen h6, this is actually still a good move and preventing the black here to go for kingside castling. Queen f6, trying to stop queen g7, but after knight takes h7, this is actually rather an equality move. For example, the white here should actually counter and make some attacks to the position of the black. For example, after rook c1, trying to win a pawn on the c7 square. And after, for example, c6, putting his pawn to be defended with the queen. But after this position, it is now the time for the black here to capture now the h7. The idea here, for example, after queen to d6, there is just a simple queen g7. And after queen to b4 check, king to d1, and again, this knight is not actually on time to reach this e4 square, for example, in this position. And again, after rook takes h7, queen takes h7, although there is queen takes b2, winning a pawn, but after queen h8, again, the white here has an extra piece on the board with extra bishop on the f1 square. So going back, for example, after queen to f6, although the white here should play rook to c1 rather than a takes on h7, but let's say for example knight takes h7, queen to d6, queen g7, queen to b4, and king to d1, escaping to the check. Rook takes h7 is a must move for the black because there is no escape for the rook from the attack of the queen. So it's better to capture the knight rather than to lose it totally. So after queen takes h7, knight f6, queen h4 is actually a blunder on this position. The white here should play queen h8 rather than queen h4 because after queen h4, there is a mate in 3. After, for example, knight to e4, king to e2, and bishop g4, and going into the checkmate. So after, for example, on this position with knight to f6, the white here should play the move queen h8 going into the equality, because after queen to e7 and queen h4, again, the white here is on the timing, for example, by playing queen to h4, because there is no longer knight to e4 because the knight is pinned, and if this knight will move, then there will be a check. So after c5, for example, b3, a5, f3, and again, the white here actually successfully defend the knight to e4, and again, giving some loop square to queen to f2. Although the black here is actually a piece down, for example, because the white here has an extra piece on f1, but as long as this is passive and the rook is not connected yet, while the white king is in danger against the possible attack or checks with the queen, for example, later on with queen a4 trying to break this pawn chain and giving a file for the rook on a8. So this is actually an equal, although the black is a material down, but the black here has an activity, for example, with his bishop and rook, knight, and queen, with a possible attack to the unsafe king on d1. So the Tartakower defense is actually came from the Queen's Gambit decline, for example, and with a significant move of playing for b6, trying to give some diagonal for the dark square bishop of black, whether this bishop will be developed on the b7 or to a6. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.